morning, everybody. It is Thursday, about almost 10 to 9. I have a meeting in about 10 minutes, well, 5 minutes before I can get into the meeting before it starts. But wanted to start off this vlog for Red Dice by Christopher Pike. This is the third book in the Thirst series. If you have missed my reviews and or vlogging of the process of reading through these, I will leave them down in the description as well as in the cards of this video. This is a reread series for me, for those of you that might be joining for the first time. And basically the whole reason I wanted to reread this series is because I loved this series a lot when I was in high school. Now so much I don't know exactly why, because as I've been reading the first two books and now going into book 3, the books are pretty disappointing. The first book, The Last Vampire, I ended up giving a 2 out of 5 stars back in June, and the second book that I just finished here yesterday from when this clip is being filmed, I gave more of like 2.5 stars. The second book was quite better in terms of, I think, the plot development, but I still had several issues with the story itself and some of the mechanics of it. So today we're going into starting off on book 3. I was actually supposed to start it yesterday, but yesterday was Robert's birthday, and so I wanted to spend time celebrating with him. So I didn't really get to do any reading yesterday, but today I do want to get to my reading goal of the day. Red Dice essentially picks up right after the events of Black Blood, where we have our main character Sita and a character that we met in the last book named Joel, who is now a vampire because of the events of Black Blood, and they are basically trying to traverse their own life, and they find out that there is a government conspiracy to kidnap them and basically test and study on their blood because the government somehow knows that they are vampires. Joel and Sita don't really know why or who is like behind this kind of thing, and unfortunately Joel gets kidnapped, and so Sita, like the heroine she is in this series, has to go and save him. For those of you that are just joining me for the first time with this series, the first 3 books of this series are in an omnibus, meaning that they are all compiled into one book. The books themselves are anywhere between about 200 to 250 pages a piece, and this series was originally written in the 90s, so that's a lot of the reasons why I have issues with it, because the writing style is just very inconsistent, and I think that in general the writing back in the 90s was not nearly as great, or at least not in this version of a young adult story from back in the 90s, because there's a lot of issues I have with it, which you can hear about in the other 2 videos I've done for this series. So my hope is that because Black Blood was marginally better than The Last Vampire, that Red Dice is going to be marginally better, because my thought is that as the series goes on, it might get better and better because the writing will have developed, the characters will have developed more, and hopefully the little kinks and stuff that happened that, you know, I didn't have such a good time with in the first 2 books might start to get ironed out a little bit. However, I'm not holding my breath, because I do know, like I said, this book was written a long time ago, over 30 years, almost 30 years ago at this point, and from what I've seen so far, this is just kind of your typical YA story that was written a long time ago that doesn't seem to hold much water. This is going to contain spoilers, and I will make sure that in the video there are timestamps listed for when those spoilers come up if you would like to go into this fairly blind for the most part. But now that we're getting into the 3rd book in the series, it's a little harder to not spoil some things that happened in the previous books, because they all pick right up after each other, and so there are going to end up being some spoilers. It's just unfortunately part of the deal when you read a series. Okay, so earlier I just finished the first chapter, and I'm getting ready to go into chapter 2 now, but I wanted to say something about the first chapter because I just almost completely forgot because I was trying to finish it before the end of my break. The first chapter is 40 pages long. That is probably the longest first chapter I think I have ever read. Now, keep in mind, the book is, you know, because it's so fast-paced and the book is short, it does fly by very quickly. But holy shit. I will say though, there was a lot that went on in that first chapter, because that was like the moment, like immediately we get into the story of Sita and Joel end up getting kidnapped by police forces, government forces, whatever, and they do find out very quickly that they're being transported to some high security place because the government wants them, but they just don't know why as of yet. And there is like a whole breakout scene. Sita steals a helicopter and all these things, and basically the helicopter explodes, and the end of the chapter is her basically getting injured and from the helicopter and then falling into this lake near the Hoover Dam and basically kind of like passing out. And this next chapter is her waking up from that. But that first chapter was intense and it was fucking long as hell. But I think that it does set up the story a lot nicer. It doesn't feel, you know, kind of weird. I still don't like the fact that Joel is now a vampire. I think that that was completely unnecessary. But the first chapter does seem very promising for what to expect with this book. So I'm hoping that the train of positive thoughts and positive outcomes of the story, you know, continues. But still don't really know how that's gonna work. Okay, so I've just read chapter 4, which is kind of like a flashback scene. It's basically a whole chapter dedicated to Sita talking about a man she had known while living in Italy named Arturo. He was a priest at the time. This is like Middle Ages, I think, and it was also an alchemist, which being a priest and an alchemist at the same time was like unheard of. Like, it was completely like two different ends of a spectrum in one person. And basically she tells the story of how Arturo essentially learned that she was a vampire and how he wanted to then somehow use her blood to try to make a hybrid or even some kind of immortal being. For some reason, reading this chapter, the name sounds familiar in terms of another character that's supposed to come up in the series. I don't know if it's the same person or just another person named Arturo, but I feel like with the way that this story was literally a full chapter plopped in the middle of this book, it leads me to believe that it's possible either this character is still alive and is going to come up in terms of who is at this military compound that Joel has been kidnapped and taken to. And if I'm not mistaken, if it's the same character that I'm thinking, he may be involved in several books towards the end of the series. Might not be the same person. I'm trying to like grasp at straws, I think, in terms of my memory of this series, because really the only thing I remember from the series was like the first book and the last book, which the last book was so just jarring and out of left field that I really didn't feel like I knew what was going on because it took a weird sci-fi turn, I think. So this chapter was really interesting. I kind of see where the threads are tying, but it also seemed very strange to just plop an entire chapter like this of backstory in the middle of this book. Like, it's still fairly early in the book, but seems a little weird to just, you know, have a whole chapter dedicated to that. But it does make it, you know, apparent enough that this is foreshadowing. It does really get the tendrils of foreshadowing involved in the story very clearly for the reader, so that they know there is some importance to this story that's being told about Arturo and Sita and how their relationship was and what Sita and Arturo had talked about when she was around.
Well, I was right. I was so very much right.
Hi guys, so please excuse the wet hair and the weird angle and all this stuff. I'm actually at my parents' house right now. I went and got my wedding dress today, so that was really exciting. It's all ready. But I just finished the last of Red Dice by Christopher Pike, the third book in the Thirst series. And surprisingly, this one actually was way better than the other two. So I'm thinking there's going to be a trend starting where hopefully the books are going to get better and better as the series goes on. This still wasn't 100% perfect. I did rate it a 3-star out of 5 though, because I think in general the overall premise of the book was really good, and I did like the actual like points of the story we got within it, but everything was still way too rushed, and I felt that because of that, the story was still very much lacking in a lot of ways. But I appreciate what Christopher Pike ended up trying to do, and I liked a lot of the points that he brought up within the plot that, you know, actually extended the story and kind of continued it on. And I'm a little hesitant to say whether or not characters are gonna come up or not, because I don't quite know what's going on, but I will get into some spoilery thoughts in this video like I did in the last one. But for right now, I'm going to go into the spoiler-free aspect of it, including the synopsis. So Red Dice picks up immediately after the events of Black Blood, where Sita has transformed Joel Drake, who is this FBI agent that was basically trying to help her with the case that was going on in Black Blood, and she basically saves his life by turning him into a vampire. And from there, they leave the house that they are at, which was Eddie Fender's, who was the bad guy in Black Blood. They go to set it on fire, but unfortunately they get stopped when several government agents seem to arrive, and they immediately take in both Sita and Joel. No one knows why. They just know that they were told to take them away toward this Las Vegas area. Not necessarily certain if it was in Las Vegas or just outside of it. But in the event of that, all within the first chapter, Sita and Joel end up escaping, and there's this big scene within the whole thing. And unfortunately though, Joel does end up getting kidnapped again by the government agents, and Sita is basically having to go and save him. That's kind of the whole point of the story. As I mentioned before in the earlier clips, there is another character that does come up that is a part of Sita's past, and this kind of goes into some spoilery stuff, but I will hold off on the spoilery aspects of it until later. But basically, there is a character that does come up that is from Sita's past who is very important. I do believe that he may or may not now have a bigger role later on. I don't remember for certain if he does, but at least I remember that this character did come up at some point in the series when I saw his name, and when I remember hearing about the background of this character and him and Sita's relationship. I vividly remembered reading about him when I was in high school. So as far as my overall thoughts of it, like I said, the book itself I think was pretty okay. It had a lot of great plot points in it that I think worked for the story, and I think were really good pieces to go into with the story and help develop the whole world a little bit more, and more about Sita's history, things of that nature. But it still was way too rushed. There wasn't enough story to it. I felt that the whole thing with the character that comes up in the story that is from Sita's past was glossed over way too much. The ending was a very kind of disappointing because we got to the climax pretty much at the very end of the last chapter, and then the epilogue was just completely nothing. Like, it was literally 2 pages and it almost didn't like do anything for the story. I think it had some good foundations, but the overall execution, again, with this having been a book made in the 90s, does not do it justice. And I think that if Christopher Pike may have had a chance to redo it, if he was to redo it in like 2020, I would be willing to bet that he would change not only this story and make it longer, but actually go back and like fix all of the books up to this point, because there are so many things that could be changed that I think would better fit the current, standards of writing that we kind of have and what we expect of writing. It's still not quite there, but I am seeing an upswing when it comes to how the stories are going as you go further in the series, which is promising. But again, I don't want to count my chickens before they hatch, because it is entirely possible we could get a book later on in the series that's going to basically make everything tank, which I'm willing to bet is going to be the very last book in the series, because I remember that was how I felt about it the first time that I read it. So now I'm going to go into some spoilery thoughts. I didn't really have much in terms of the spoiler-free things. I felt like a lot of the feelings I had were fairly similar, but I did feel like the story overall actually was a lot better. I still didn't care for the voice, still didn't care for, the lack of information, but I think the general idea of this story was well done, and I think that it just should have been extended. It should have had way more to it. But now we're getting into spoilery thoughts, so please, if you do not want to be spoiled for what happens in this book, please go to the timestamp listed down below. That way you can avoid it as much as you can if you are interested in reading the series. Otherwise, let's get into some spoilery things. Okay, so the character that comes up that's from Sita's past is named Arturo. Arturo was basically an alchemist back in the, I think it was like 11th, maybe 12th century kind of thing. Like, he's basically not quite Middle Ages like I originally thought. He's a little bit older than that. He's like from 700 years ago, so I'm thinking like 12th century almost. He was also a Catholic priest at the time, so that is very weird. I did talk a little bit about that earlier in the video, so I did kind of spoil something, but it's not like a big spoil. He is a character that, you know, is supposed to come up at some point, and you just learn a little bit more about him. What's interesting about him is that back in this time when he and Sita were together, and they were not really having a sexual relationship as of yet, but they were kind of like dating in a sense, Arturo was basically trying to find a way to make people become not fully vampires, like basically create a hybrid race, because he understood that in Sita's past, because she had gone through and told him everything, and there was an incident that she had to explain to herself with Arturo, she basically like gave him this inspiration to want to create a hybrid race, because he saw that it wasn't good to be all vampire, but humans weren't necessarily like the strongest things in the world. So he wanted to try to find a way to create hybrids through alchemy. Arturo in the past tries to do this, and he gets in a lot of trouble, basically gets burned at the stake supposedly, and Sita never sees him again, thinking he's dead. But it turns out that that is not the case, and actually he's the one that has kidnapped her and Joel, because he's still continuing in his research, but it's no longer for a Christ-like kind of matter like it was back then, because back in the past he kind of claimed it was so that he could do God's will, which he believed that what he was doing was God's will, because he thought that it was with, you know, best intention. He just wanted to make the human race more, you know, able to survive and for longer and against more predators and, you know, things of that nature, and make them stronger. This is also during like the Inquisition, so in like Italy, so that may have something to do with it. Maybe he was trying to find a way to protect himself in the event that he was looked at by the Inquisition because of his, you know, free thinking and things of that nature, because they were very much against things like witchcraft, and I mean, you'd see that over the course of history. So the thing with Arturo though, I loved that he was brought up in this story, because he is someone that Sita did fall in love with and was a huge part of her life, but is somebody that she found that is able to possibly bring her down. And you see in the story this kind of fight with Sita herself, because Arturo at one point when in the past gives her the ability to be tested on so that she could possibly be reverted back to human, so she could have a child again. Because if you read the other two books in the series, you know that Sita in the past had a family. Before she was turned into a vampire, she had a husband and she had a daughter named Lolita. And unfortunately, Sita was basically kidnapped by Yaksha and taken away, turned into a vampire, and she never saw her husband and daughter again. So when Arturo basically gives her this ability to, you know, possibly, you know, have a child again, she's all for it at first, but then something happens and it makes her like no longer want to do this and goes against Arturo. And it's this inner battle though, because she really wants this child so much. She wants to be able to be human again, because she never wanted to be a vampire in the first place. She just thought she could never, you know, go back to how she was because Yaksha turned her. But what's also interesting is that coupled with that kind of resentment for being a vampire, now with the fact that since Black Blood, Sita has basically taken on Yaksha's powers after having killed him in Black Blood to sustain herself, and Yaksha was ready to go. He was ready to leave this plane. She now has some new abilities because of Yaksha's power. She's stronger, she's faster, she's actually even able to turn herself invisible, which is interesting. She's a bigger reach when it comes to her mental manipulation. Like, there's a shit ton of things she's now able to do that, again, I don't think got really explored too much other than for convenience purposes, which kind of makes sense given the situation she was in with trying to save Joel and trying to use her powers in the most smart way possible. But the thing is like, you see this weird conflict with Sita, because she doesn't really want to be a vampire anymore. She's kind of done with it. She has been for a long time. But also now that she has these powers, she doesn't want to give that up, because she knows it's a bad idea for anyone other than her to have these powers. And she kind of is interested in the idea that Yaksha's blood has given her so many new abilities to where she can have a more stronger life as a vampire. So it's an interesting kind of look at Sita as a person, because we see these two sides of her more sentimental side and her kind of more, I wouldn't say devious or animal side by any means. I would just say it's kind of more of like her vampire side, I guess, because she spent a vampire for 5,000 years. she's never really had an opportunity to become human again, and she doesn't really think that's ever going to happen. However, very end of this one, we find out that Arturo actually still has supplies from when he was back in the Inquisition time that he used to heal and used to essentially work with Sita when they were, you know, younger in the Inquisition time. And he tells her before he dies that, I'm not sure if he's, you know, really dead, but as far as I know, he was blasted by a nuclear warhead, so I'm assuming he's dead. But he tells Sita that all of his supplies are still in his house. So this is where the epilogue really confused me, because the epilogue was basically, she called Seymour, who is a character we meet in The Last Vampire, who we kind of see off and on throughout the series. I think he's a useless character, but that's whatever. She calls him up to help her do this ritual that Arturo used to do back in the Inquisition time, when he would basically try to map out the auras of the individuals that he worked on so that he could use those auras to possibly heal them or change them in some way. I think it worked, and she's now possibly human. The epilogue was very confusing, and she wakes up from this whole experience and someone's at the door and she doesn't know who it is, but she feels like she might be human. She doesn't really know, and that's it. So it's entirely possible in book 4 we're going to find out whether or not Sid is really a human now, or if she's still a vampire. And I'm interested to see if Arturo does somehow survive what's going on, and if he does, when does he come back in the series? Because I, for some reason, thought that by the end of the series, he was back and he was badder than ever, and I thought for some reason he was one of those characters that was going to kind of like be the hidden bad guy at the very end of the series. Like, I don't know. I could be completely wrong. But that is basically all I have to say about Red Dice. I mean, it's kind of the same thoughts, like I said, of the other books in the series, where it's, you know, not necessarily what I think would be marketable or sellable really in like 2020. It's very juvenile. It really has like a lot of issues in terms of not just the length, but the writing style, and some of the characters seem to be fairly useless and are only there for like maybe one purpose, and that's it, as opposed to having like an actual like storyline kind of thing. So I don't know, it's kind of weird. I don't know how to feel about the series as of yet, but I will say that I did, like I said, give Red Dice a 3 out of 5 stars. It was actually the better of the 3 I've read so far. I'm interested to see how the rest of the series goes, considering we're on this upswing, and Red Dice was actually probably one of the more developed, really kind of stories. So anyway, thank you guys so much for joining me in this vlog slash review for Red Dice by Christopher Pike. Again, let me know if you guys have read this series yourselves and what your thoughts were down in the comments below. And as always, if you guys did enjoy this video, please do give it a big thumbs up. And if you're not already and you'd like to be, hit that button down below and subscribe to become an owlet in our flock. And I will see all of you guys in my next video. Bye guys!